Good evening. It's great to be with you all. I know you feel like I do about opening back up the assemblies and getting back together. You don't sometimes realize how important something is to you until it gets taken away. And certainly the ability to assemble, the freedoms that we have, are something that have been so abundant for us that it makes it possible, not necessarily that everybody does, but it makes it possible to take it for granted. And this little while of being quarantined has, I think, opened our eyes and maybe at least refreshed in us a great appreciation for being able to assemble. And I know not everybody's getting back out yet. Some are still being very careful about their health, and certainly we pray for them and hope that they continue to be well and that the church will rebound from this and continue forward, maybe like we have not in a while. Cause us to be a little more evangelistic, to reach out further, and hopefully open some more minds and hearts with the gospel. I love the fact that y'all have dealt with questions for the last several summer series you've done. I was listening last week with Brother Dedman, and the idea of you having, Chad was commenting on the fact that you did Old Testament questions, New Testament questions, and now questions that deity asks. You know, questions are a wonderful tool of communication and language. Everybody can appreciate someone who is asking questions because they're looking for information. We do this on a daily basis. If we're out in public and looking for a place, we may have to ask for directions. If you come to a new place and you're not sure where everything is, you may be asking people, where's the best place to eat in town? Where's the best place to get a room to stay and spend the night? Sometimes it's just very simple information we're looking for. Sometimes it's much deeper, much more important information. You start having a health issue and you start talking to people and saying, who's the best doctor for me to go see about this? That's more important to you than just maybe where to go eat or where to spend the night. So sometimes our questions are much more important, and the answers that we're receiving thus are so much more important to us. When we start thinking about asking questions, we know that in our postmodern era, there are a lot of people who ask questions in a way that are trying to do damage. They will ask questions with a purpose of trying to harm or destroy somebody's faith. Sometimes questions are asked deceptively. Think of the number of times when somebody asked Jesus a question and they weren't really looking for information. It tells us in the text they were tempting him, they were testing him, they were trying to get something on him to use against him. So sometimes questions can be good, sometimes questions, when they're coming from an ill motive, can be very bad. The good thing about Jesus was he knew their hearts. He knew why they were asking. When they came to him and asked the question, by what authority are you doing these things? He said, I'll answer your question if you'll answer mine. Well, what a beautiful way he dealt with these people and said, the baptism of John, whence was it, from heaven or from men? Well, we can't tell. Well, then I'm not answering your question. Great ways, because Jesus knew the hearts of men. He knew what was behind their questions. We don't have that luxury. We don't have that capability. So when people ask questions, sometimes we're trying to figure out where they're coming from and what they're doing. When you assume that someone has a good motive in what they're doing, there are only a few reasons to ask questions. Either to gain information, maybe you don't know anything about something, so you're just asking for general information. Maybe you have some information and you're trying to clarify it, trying to get someone to give you further information, or at least to verify what information you have. But sometimes when we ask a question, there's a different motive. Not a bad motive, just a different motive. We're trying to get someone to think about something. If you've raised children, you have used this method, whether you've stopped and think about it or not. You ask them questions sometimes to make them focus on something, think about something, to contemplate differently. You're hoping they're going to learn a lesson from it, that they're going to get a point from what you're asking. So you're actually asking in a teaching way. And when we think about God, understand that that's the way God always asks questions. God does not have to ask a question of anybody to gain information. God doesn't need information from us. God knows everything that we know and infinitely more. He doesn't need information from us. God doesn't ask us questions so that he can clarify information or gain maybe additional information. He never has that need. So when God asks questions, we know why he's asking them. He's asking them, and that's whether you're dealing with God speaking from his heavenly realm or when Jesus was here upon the earth, asking questions to get people to think about something, get them to focus on something, get them to contemplate differently whatever matter is at hand. And tonight, the questions that we're dealing with are no different. We're looking at Jesus from Matthew chapter 16. And if you look at this, you come down through here and you get a picture of the setting that's taking place. And the first 4 verses, it's Jesus talking to the Pharisees and Sadducees. Well, if you know anything about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and even some in Acts and a little further, reading about the Pharisees and Sadducees, they didn't get along with each other. They had very different perspectives and points of view and different doctrines on a number of things. And so when you see the Pharisees and Sadducees in the current setting, most of the time they're separated from each other. The few times that we see them coming together are when you're seeing a situation of the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend. We don't get along with each other, but right now that guy's the bigger problem, so let's come together and get him. So sometimes we'll see them join forces, if you will, to try to trap Jesus, try to tempt him, try to attack him in different ways, mostly underhanded ways. And so we see them doing the same thing here. Jesus is making some statements, talking to them, and they're taking what he's saying and trying to make it literal, physical statements when Jesus is talking about spiritual things. But this is not just a problem with the Pharisees and Sadducees. You get to verse 5 and continue on. It says that Jesus, first he was with them apparently on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Now it says he goes over to the other side and he's with his disciples. And when he makes a statement here to his disciples, they do something very similar to what the Pharisees and Sadducees do. They take it the wrong way. Instead of taking it as a spiritual statement, when he says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, they take it literally. What does leaven have to do with anything literally? Well, it's a leavening agent, yeast. It makes bread rise. Something that the Jews, very often because of what God had done with them in the past, shunned and stayed away from, eating bread that was unleavened. But he makes a comment about the leaven, and they realize we don't have any bread. We forgot to bring any bread. If you look at Mark and Luke's account, in one of them it says they only brought 1 loaf. They didn't bring enough for everybody. So they're without bread. He makes a comment about leaven. They immediately think about physical bread, and they lock in on that. And Jesus has to do with them like he does so many times and let them see that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not wanting to make a point to you about the fact that we need to eat it sometime today. I'm trying to give you a point about the doctrine of the Pharisees. And by the time you get to verse 12, that's what it says. They come to finally understand he's talking about this doctrine rather than about literal physical bread. So you get to verse 13. And they've come to the coasts of Caesarea Philippi. And notice what Jesus does. I don't know, Chad, y'all may have somebody else in this summer series that's going to talk about this particular question, so I'm not going to deal with that question a lot. I just want to make a point that Jesus uses a question here to bring them to the right mindset for the next question. He uses one question to introduce the next question. Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? Notice how he asked that. He didn't just say, who do men say that I am? He uses a qualifier. Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And they start telling him some answers. And boy, what answers they tell him. Wouldn't you be happy? Wouldn't you be excited if you ask somebody, what are people saying about me? And they say, man, you're like these great prophets of the Old Testament. You're like John the Baptizer. They think that's who you are. You're one of these men. I would be ecstatic if somebody looked at me and said, you must be the resurrected Elijah. You must be Jeremiah. You must be John the Baptizer. I'd say, wonderful. It's not who I am, but I'm glad you think of me that way. But it doesn't matter who they said. If they didn't say Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, then those people were missing something very big. Someone who was standing in front of them who was different from anybody they had ever known or ever heard of in this world. So they give these answers. Well, then Jesus uses that to prompt the real question of this moment. Whom say ye that I am? Now, all right, now I've got you thinking about what everybody else is saying. What about you? And it was Peter that answered, as was often the case, and said, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus makes this statement, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood have not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. You didn't get this from men. Men are saying different things about me. Men will say different things about me. 2,000 years later, men are still saying different things about Jesus. But he said, what you just said is of divine revelation. What you just said is what comes from God himself. That I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. And based on that confession, based on the power of that statement, I'm going to build my church. And the gates of Hades, I know if you're reading King James, or some of them say the gates of hell, that's literally Hades. The gates of Hades are not going to prevent me from building my church. What was his point? He's going to explain it further in just a moment to them. But his point was, I am going to die. But unlike everybody else you know who dies, death is not going to hold me. I'm going to be there for 3 days, the separation of body and spirit. But after those 3 days, my soul is coming out of Hades, and my soul is going back to my body, and my body's coming back out of the tomb. Hades is not going to prevent me from establishing my church. In fact, this whole process is essential to the establishment of my church. I have to go through this. When he makes this statement, the disciples are fine with it. They're loving the fact that he's talking about his kingdom, his church, talking about what he's going to do. They love hearing this. But immediately following this, listen, Jesus brought them to that statement with his questions, making them think. Whom do men say that I am? Whom say ye that I am? And when the great confession there comes forth, it doesn't hold very long, does it? What am I talking about? Immediately following this, it says that from this time, Jesus began to explain to them, to help his disciples understand that he is going to have to be delivered. He's going to have to be crucified. He's going to be resurrected. He's explaining to them about what we commonly call the passion, the resurrection, the ascension, these things that are going to have to take place for him to be who he needs to be, having shed his blood so that he can establish his church, purchase salvation for all men. This is all part of the process. He said, I'm going to build my church. You're going to have the keys of the kingdom. They're hearing these things and saying, yes, I'm going to have to be delivered. I'm going to be killed, buried, raised. And what does Peter say? Not you, Lord. But he does it in a way that's not just him saying, oh, I don't like the sound of that. It says that he takes Jesus and begins to rebuke him. You know what that means? It means to correct someone who is wrong. He is trying to correct Jesus about what Jesus' goal and purpose and mission is. I don't like the sound of this, so not only am I going to say I don't like the sound of it, I'm going to correct you and I'm going to straighten you out on this, Jesus. He rebukes Jesus. At which point Jesus says to him, get thee behind me, Satan. He's not being ugly to Peter. What he's saying to Peter is, you, if you had your way, would stop me from fulfilling my mission, my work, my goal. That's exactly what Satan would want to do. He's letting Peter know it's not just that you're stepping out of your bounds and rebuking me, but you're speaking out against the entire will and plan of God that's here for the salvation of mankind from sin. If I follow what you say, then I might as well follow what Satan said when he tempted, when he tested me. Get thee behind me, Satan. But then he builds on this, and this is where we lead up to our questions for the evening. Two questions, both found in verse 26. In verse 24, leading up to this, he starts talking about anyone who's going to be my follower, anyone who's going to be my disciple. We've got the setting now for this great question, for these two great questions that come. And it's really the same question, just looking from two perspectives. He says in verse 24, you're going to have to deny yourself. You're going to be my follower. You're going to have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. In Luke's account, he makes the point that taking up your cross is a daily activity, something you're going to have to do on a regular basis, not just one time. Not like the crucifixion of Jesus, that was a one-time event. You're going to have to take up your cross daily in following me. And what precedes taking up your cross daily is denying yourself. Peter, you just told me I don't want you to go through that. I'm going to correct you on that. Understand that this is a selfish request. What you're saying, while I know it comes out of a care for me personally, it's a selfish request. You want to keep me here. You want to have me here. You want us to continue to have the relationship that we've been having. And I'm telling you that's not my goal. That's not my purpose, to continue to have this relationship. It did serve its purpose while I'm here, but my purpose is also to die, to shed my blood, to be buried, to be raised, to ascend, to make an offering at the throne of God of my own blood as a high priest in the heavenly realm, so that I can take my throne in that heavenly realm, so that my kingdom can be established and I can reign over it. This is all part of the process. You don't need to speak against that. You don't need to try to rebuke me and change that. You need to deny yourself. You need to deny your will. You need to deny your own thinking that comes from within you, and you need to be listening to what is revealed to you from heaven. Deny yourself. And if you're called upon, like me, and you will be, to suffer, to face these same kinds of things, these same difficulties, you need to be willing on a daily basis to go through whatever you have to that's according to God's will, that's keeping you walking faithfully with Him. You deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me. In verse 25, listen, this is the crux of the matter. He says, whosoever shall save his life shall lose it. And whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. That's what verse 26 is talking all about. If you are willing to put aside the will of God, put aside Christ, put aside spiritual matters and things, eternal matters and things, for the here and the now, then you will lose. You will lose ultimately, you will lose eternally. But if you are willing to do God's will, if you put yourself in submission to His will, and you do His will, no matter what it costs you here, then some will look at this and say you're losing something here, but what you're gaining is spiritual, it is eternal. The gain that you have in following the will of God is not comparable to the gain that you have if you give up God's will and only focus on this world. He says that's what we're talking about. So the questions come. I've laid out some information here for you. I've told you you're going to have to deny self. You're going to have to take up your cross. You're going to have to follow me. I've told you this is a matter of spiritual benefit, not material, not earthly. So now let's put it in a question that will make you think about it differently. In verse 26, he says, "For what is a man profited?" You know, I don't know of any other time in history. Of course, I have only lived in this time in history, but reading a lot of things about history, I don't know of any other time where people are more cognizant of money, especially in our culture. Money, money, money. The money we make and live on today, the money we can save and invest and have set for the future, looking at making a living now, having retirement when we're done working. I don't know of any time that I've read about where people are more cognizant of this and understanding of what money means. So this is a very pertinent question. what does it profit? What is the, what is the bottom line? That's a very popular phrase, isn't it? What's the bottom line? What's it going to cost me? Or what's my profit or benefit going to be? That's something that concerns very much of what we do and focus on in this world. So where is the profit if a man shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? That's not supposed to be a question that takes a whole lot to understand it. It's a simple question, but you can ponder on it for days. You can ponder on it for the next several years. It may not be a hard question to understand, but this is a very difficult question to hear, to think through, and to apply to our benefit. What will you ultimately profit if you gain everything material and give up everything that's spiritual? What's your profit? What's your bottom line? Where do you come out ahead? Because we know that material gain, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with material gain. Jesus taught more parables about money than he did about heaven. Does that tell you something? There's a problem in the mind of man in getting locked in on the here and the now. And Jesus was constantly trying to teach people, you don't need to lock in on the here and now. Money is useful. It's a tool. It should benefit you, but it's only a temporal benefit. At best, it will only benefit you as long as you live in this world. And then it's done. You know, we've heard people who have done some extravagant things with funerals, haven't we? Take somebody and bury them in their favorite car. Why? What purpose is there? Unless you've got a convoluted idea about what's going to happen after death, you're going to maybe be raised in some other form or something. I don't know. There's lots of ideas out there. But unless you're going to come back and be able to drive, what's the point? Bring a bank vault with you and drop it in there with all the millions of dollars that somebody earned over the years. What's the point? Somebody else could be benefiting from that. That person's not going to anymore. What's the gain or the benefit if you have everything material and lose your soul? Very simple question. But ponder it long and hard. Because there are so many, even Christians, who get wrapped up in the money and the material that it comes first, even when they don't really think that it does. Think on it long and hard. He follows it up with a second question that's hitting the same problem from the other side. What's the profit if you gain the whole world materially and lose your soul? Or what would you give for your soul? You know what happens when people who are godless people get sick to the point of dying? Do you realize how their priorities shift? That person who last week could not think of anything more important than building their portfolio is now laying in a hospital bed saying, I would give every bit of it if you could guarantee me another month, another year, another decade. If I could save my life, I'd give it all up. You know what you don't hear people saying on their deathbed in the hospital? You don't hear them saying, boy, I wish I'd saved a little bit more. I wish I'd gathered a little bit more so I could hand it to my kids and grandkids. No, usually what you hear them saying, godless people, usually what you hear them saying is, I wish I'd spent more time with my family. I wish I'd lived a better life. I wish I'd done more good in this world. Godly people get to that point and they say, I'm ready to go to heaven. I'm ready to go to my Father. I'm ready to go be with the Savior. I'm ready to be through with this. Like Paul. I'm ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand. I've fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth, there's a crown of righteousness laid up for me. He didn't have any worries about that. You remember what Paul said in Philippians 4? I've learned something that the world doesn't know and doesn't hold. It's contentment. I've learned to be content. When I've been blessed with much, great. When I've done without, that's okay too. I've learned to be content with those kinds of things because I've got something that's so much more important that you can't really compare the two. I've got my spiritual well-being. I've got eternal life laid out in front of me. So he asked these two questions. What are you profited if you gain everything and lose your soul? Then come in from the other side, what would you give in exchange for your soul? Well, it's a very quick answer on both of them. Nothing and everything. Two different perspectives, same idea. Disciples, if you keep focusing on me being here in the flesh and setting up a fleshly, earthly kingdom and all the things focused on the here and the now and what's going on, you're missing the point of who I am and why I came. That's not what my life is about here. There is the here and the now and what needs to be accomplished, but it's leading to something much further, something much bigger. And the salvation of every sinner in this world is depending on, on me going through this whole process, not on just part of it. Did Jesus bless people while he was here? In this chapter, he reminded the disciples about how he fed the 5,000, how he fed the 4,000, one time with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, one time with 7 loaves. If you're talking about the physical, Jesus blessed a lot of people. He gave food to the hungry. He made lame people walk, blind people see. We even read about him calling a dead man out of a tomb. But do you realize what happened when he called Lazarus out of the tomb? Where would Lazarus have had to be for Jesus to call his body out of the tomb? Where was his soul? It had to be in Hades. That's where souls go when they're separated from the body in death. How happy do you think Lazarus was to come walking out of that tomb and realize, I'm alive on earth again? There's only one way that Jesus could call Lazarus out of the tomb, and that's if Lazarus was a righteous, faithful man. If he was not, if he was to be condemned, then he got a second chance at righteousness, at forgiveness. God doesn't do that. So he had to be a righteous man, a faithful man, called out of the tomb and had to live here again. As much as we cling to life, can you imagine the look on his face walking out of that tomb? He's probably not coming out going, yes, I get to live again. I get sick and hurt and suffer and cry and go through all temptations and difficulties only to die again. Much bigger and more important things than simply looking at the here and now. The here and now is important. But the importance of the here and now is in looking beyond. It's in looking ahead. And Jesus makes this point to them, and then through these questions draws it in for their consideration. And that's exactly what we need to do with this today. We need to not just look at this as a question that Jesus asked his disciples. We need to look at this as a question that's posed for our contemplation. There's a reason that it was written down, a reason that it was included in Scripture, a reason why 2,000 years later we get to read these questions. Because we need to think about these things just as surely as they did and not get ourselves caught up in focusing our entire life on what can be gained here, on having life here. We need to be looking beyond. We need to be focusing on the spiritual, on what's eternal. So ask the question and ponder it, not just right now. Ponder it daily. Ponder it carefully. What is the profit of gaining everything to the detriment, to the loss of our souls? What would you give for your soul? There are stories that have been written in literature about the crossroads, people meeting the devil at the crossroads and making a deal with the devil. Probably one of the most famous stories about this is Robert Johnson, who disappeared for a little while, showed back up, and was the best blues player that anybody had heard. He was amazing. And so the story was told and was written that he had gone to the crossroads and met the devil and traded his soul for talent, for skill. It's one thing to look at that and say, well, that's just a story. We know that's not real. We know that didn't actually happen. But how many people are selling their souls every day for different things in this world? How many Christians over the years have come to that salvation in the blood of Christ, become citizens of His kingdom, members of His body, and eventually have sold their soul for other things in this world? For a relationship, for a job, position, power, influence, just simply money. We need to ask those questions, and we need to think on them on a regular basis. They're given to us for a reason. We never need to let the physical overcome the spiritual. We never need to let we're not talking about ungodly things. We're simply talking about material things. Are there people in the Bible who had a lot of material things who still followed God? Yes. And there are people in the Bible who don't have many material things who followed God. The material things are not what makes the difference. It's the heart of the individual. It's the person who has those things in their possession. We need to be careful in the way we think about ownership. Do you realize we don't own anything? And I'm not talking about government and taxes. That's not the discussion. To truly own something means you have total control of it. And what that means is there's really only one possession that we have in this world that we have ownership of. And that's ourself, our own soul. The choices we make, the decisions, the temptations, the struggles, the problems, and where we end up standing every step along the way. That's who we are, and that's what we own. Everything else is passing. Everything, even our physical lives. You think you have ownership of your physical life? Grab onto it and hold on. And one day, like everybody else, it will depart. And you'll come to realize, I didn't own that at all. You step out in front of a bus, you find out real quickly, I don't have ownership of this. I have ownership of who I am, of the choices I make, the stances I take, who I ally myself with, who I'm living for. You want to see what this picture is? Jesus explains to them very clearly, I'm going to give myself for you. And if you're going to be my follower, you're going to give yourself to me. Because if you live your life, you live what comes from within you, your choices, your will, instead of God's will, then there's going to come a time of accounting, and you're going to face me in judgment. That's how the chapter ends. Just after he asks these questions and gets them thinking along these lines, in verses 27 and 8, he says, judgment's coming. Now there's some of you standing here that will not die until you see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom. You're going to see the church come. You're going to see salvation come. You're going to see these things being fulfilled, me doing what I'm supposed to do. But there's going to be a time of judgment where what's going to be evaluated is, did you do what you're supposed to do? Did you live with the right focus? Did you live a sacrificial life so that you could receive the benefits of my sacrificial life? I'm dying for you, and I'm calling on you to live for me. These are some wonderful questions that should cause us to think, to reflect, to focus on the spiritual, on the eternal, on what's coming for every faithful child of God. And we should be looking for and longing for the time when we get to stand before Him in judgment. We should be anticipating and looking for the time when we get to enter into an eternal home with our Savior, with our Father, with the righteous of all the generations of man. That should not be something that we are pulling back from. I remember the old country's an older song now. It still hits me as something young because I first heard it when I was younger, but it's an old song now. The man was singing, I want to go to heaven, but I don't want to go tonight. Why not? I'm not saying we should want to give up life. That's not the point. But if we're ready to go, and if we have the right perspective and thoughts about what's coming for us, we should be anticipating Jesus' return. We should be anticipating getting beyond this world and going to the home that God has prepared for us from the foundation of this world. Who are you tonight? Are you worldly? And again, I'm not talking necessarily about wicked things. Are you focused on the material and on the things of this world so much that they get in the way of your spiritual focus in life? If so, you need to make a change. And the way to make that change is through faith. You need to get into the book. You need to get into the will of God. You need to be reading and studying and pondering, considering who you are and who you want to be now and eternally. If you are a child of God and you've never really had this kind of focus, then you need to change. If you're not a child of God, then that's a part of gaining this focus, is building the faith that's necessary that when it's there will drive you to do whatever God tells you to do. Sometimes people question us about the plan of salvation. I love it when people question it because it's all a matter of faith. When someone says, well, I don't think you have to do that. Right here, I don't say it bluntly or in an ugly way, but I know what this means is you don't have the faith that you should have. And that's because you're not focusing on what's spiritual and eternal, and you need to change that. If you are not a Christian, you need to become one. You need to have a change of focus, a change of life. You need to be forgiven of sins. You need to have the hope that the blood of Jesus can bring to anyone who will come to him. If you have we have an opportunity, if you have a need to respond to the Lord's invitation tonight, then we're here to help you. If you have that need and it comes stronger for you tomorrow, in the coming weeks, the coming months, then you need to respond at the first opportunity that you have. And I don't mean at the end of a sermon. You need to respond by getting in touch with Chad, getting in touch with the elders, getting in touch with the deacons, getting in touch with anybody who will take you to the Bible, show you what needs to be done, help you understand so that you by faith can obey the will of God and have God reigning over your life. Submission, obedience, moved by faith. That's what every one of us is supposed to have and the way we're supposed to live every day. We have this opportunity. If you have a need tonight, you may come at this time as we stand and sing this song. Oh, do not